StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
In our last Bible story, we learned that Jesus spoke to his disciples about what was going to happen to him. Remember what he told them? He said, "We're on the way to Jerusalem now, and there I'll be given over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they've said that I should be put to death at once. But on the third day, I'll rise again." The disciples didn't understand what Jesus meant, and even now, after all this time that they had spent listening to Jesus teach, they were still wondering who were going to have the highest places in the kingdom. The mother of James and John came to Jesus, asking that her two sons be given the highest places next to Jesus himself. In a few moments, we'll learn what happened next as we conclude our story titled, Jesus' Last Journey to Jerusalem.
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family because it's time for this week's Bible story.
When they heard what the mother of James and John had asked Jesus, the 10 other disciples were angry because they all wanted the same thing, and perhaps they thought that Jesus might give these highest places to those who had asked for them first. Perhaps they considered themselves more worthy of high places than James and John. At any rate, the other disciples didn't think James and John had any more right to high places in the kingdom than they themselves had. Again, Jesus tried to teach them that the one who would be the greatest must be the least. The greatest must be willing to forget himself and think of others, even as Jesus, who had worked for others all his life instead of having others work for him. After a short rest, Jesus and his disciples started again on their journey. As they came near to Jericho, they saw 2 blind men sitting by the wayside begging. Though these men couldn't see what was going on, they could tell by the sound that a great many people were passing. One of the 2 blind men, whose name was Bartimaeus, asked what it all meant, and they were told that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. Bartimaeus knew that name, and he also knew that Jesus had spoken to other blind men and given them sight. So now Bartimaeus called out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." He called so loudly that people tried to quieten him down, but he wouldn't be quieted. Jesus stood still and commanded that the blind man be brought to him. Willing people called out to Bartimaeus, "Be of good cheer, rise, he's calling you." And then they led both blind Bartimaeus and his blind friend to Jesus, who said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they answered, "Lord, we want our eyes opened." Jesus touched their eyes and said, "Your belief in me has made you well." The blind eyes could see now. And the 2 men followed Jesus, praising God for what had been done for them. And all the people, when they saw what Jesus did, also praised God. The travelers, who were now a large company of people, arrived at Jericho. This was a busy city where there was a lot of buying and selling going on. And as a certain share of the money taken in this way belonged to the Roman government, many publicans lived in the city also to collect this money. One of the most noted of these publicans was a man named Zacchaeus. And when Zacchaeus heard that Jesus was passing through the city, he wanted to see him. Zacchaeus was a very short man, and he couldn't see over the heads of people, but he was so anxious to see Jesus, of whom everyone was talking, that he ran out ahead and climbed up in a tree on the road along which he knew Jesus would pass. And as Jesus drew near, he looked up into the tree, and he saw Zacchaeus, and he said, "Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for I want to stay at your house today." What an honor for Zacchaeus. He didn't need to be called twice, but he came right down from the tree as quickly as he could, and with joy welcomed Jesus in his home. The people didn't like Jesus going with Zacchaeus, and they muttered, "He's going to be the guest of a man who's a sinner." Perhaps Zacchaeus was a wicked man. Perhaps he hadn't always been honest. But the loving spirit of his guest, Jesus, made him want to be good and honest and to begin a different life right away. So Zacchaeus said, loud enough for everybody to hear, "Lord, half of my goods I'll give to the poor. And if I've taken anything from any man dishonestly, I'll give him back 4 times as much as I've taken." And Jesus said to Zacchaeus, "This day is salvation come to this house. I came to earth on purpose to seek and to save that which was lost." Jesus knew that a man who was willing to do as much as Zacchaeus was willing to do to undo his wrong actions had started in the right direction. Zacchaeus was surely a better man after this. But even though Jesus had done Zacchaeus so much good and had made an honest man of him, the people still were displeased to think that he was friendly with a publican. Didn't he claim to be their king? Wasn't he even then on his way to Jerusalem where he would set up his throne? That's what they thought and what they hoped would happen. Knowing their thoughts, Jesus told them this parable. A certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom, and then, after he had been made king, he expected to return. Before he left home, he called his 10 servants together, and he gave to each of them the same amount of money, saying, "I want you to make the best use you can of this now until I come back." Now, his people didn't like this nobleman, and they sent this message to the far country: "We'll not have this man rule over us." No attention was paid to the message. The nobleman received his kingdom and returned. And again he called his servants, to whom he'd given the money, that he might find out what each one had been doing. The first man came gladly, for he had done his best with the money. He passed it to his master, saying, "Lord, here's your money, and 10 times as much more as you gave me." And to him the nobleman said, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Because you've been faithful over a little, you'll now be ruler over 10 cities." The second man, too, was glad to come, for he'd done his best also. He said, "Lord, here's 5 times as much as you gave me." The nobleman praised him also and said, "Well done. You shall be ruler over 5 cities." The next man came unwillingly, for he had done nothing with his master's money. He hung his head in shame as he said, "Lord, here's your money, which I've kept laid away in a napkin. I was afraid of you, for I know how strict you are and how much you expect everyone to do." The nobleman said to this man, "If you knew that I expected a great deal, Why didn't you try to make my money earn all it could, so that when I came back I could have received all that belonged to me? And then he said to those that stood by, take all that this man has away from him and give it to the one who's been the most faithful. In this parable, Jesus himself is the nobleman, and heaven is the faraway country. Those to whom Jesus was talking were the servants, and so are we, actually, for Jesus hasn't yet come back from heaven. We must make the best use of everything Jesus has given us if we want to hear these words from Jesus, well done, good and faithful servant. After the rest at Jericho, the travelers were ready to climb the long hill that lay between Jericho and Jerusalem. It took 5 or 6 hours to make that trip, and they gave themselves enough time to finish the journey before sunset, for it was Friday, and at sunset the children of Israel's Sabbath began. The little village of Bethany was between Jericho and Jerusalem, and when they came to this village, Jesus and his disciples, leaving the rest of the party, went to the home where Jesus was always welcome, the home of Martha and Mary. And there he quietly spent his Sabbath day, happy in knowing that he was among friends who loved him. The Passover didn't begin until the next Thursday at sunset, but many children of Israel from the country had already arrived in Jerusalem, and they were asking each other, do you think Jesus will come to the feast? Perhaps some in the party who had traveled part of the way with Jesus had told them that he was now at Bethany.
Sent from somewhere to my soul, how they linger ever near me, and the sacred past unfold. Precious memories, how they linger, how they ever flood my soul. In the stillness of the midnight, precious